Go ahead and take your copy of God's Word, open it to John chapter 20. We're going to begin here at the beginning of this chapter, John 20. We're going to look at the first few verses of the chapter this morning. I want you to start by thinking about something that is permanent, something that is unchangeable. And some of you guys who have worked with adhesives before, and you want to get everything just right before that adhesive sets, because you know when it dries, there's no moving it. It is stuck. It is there. It is permanent. It's just you can't do anything with it. Well, we start thinking about that, and we think, well, no, that's not the most unchangeable thing. That's not the most permanent thing. I guess we could always we'd have to tear it up a little bit. We'd have to tear it down and break some things, but it can be fixed. And then we think about concrete when it's in the liquid form and you're building a building and you want to get everything set before that concrete dries, because once it dries, there's no moving it. But then we start thinking about that too, and we think, well, we could tear it up, we could start over. It can be fixed. We start thinking about other things like words. Words, once they're said, they can do some damage, can't they? Words have some lingering effects, and we start thinking about that, and we think, you know what, even that can be fixed. There is a way. There's forgiveness. There's fixing relationships can be fixed. Well, I want to tell you about something today that cannot be changed, and it's death. Death cannot be changed. All the doctors and all the scientists have tried to figure out the essence of life and the very way that a person is alive, and is there a way to bring someone back from the dead? Is there a way to reverse death itself? And the answer is no. Death is permanent. I want you to begin by thinking about what's happened up to this point before John chapter 20. Jesus has gone to a garden, and that's where he is arrested. He is arrested and he stands trial. He is then punished, he is scourged, he is mocked, he is beaten, he is crucified, and on the cross he surrendered his life and he died. Death cannot be reversed, can it? He has died. He is then placed in a tomb. Joseph of Arimathea places him in his family's tomb, and he is wrapped in linen clothes. Look at verse 41 and 42 of John 19, and this really it's part of a setting, really, is the last couple of verses of chapter 19 before we get into our text. And verse 41 says, "Now in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden." I got to stop here for just a second, because this is really where the Bible begins, isn't it? The Bible begins in a garden. The Bible begins in chapter 2, there is a garden, and God creates man and woman, and he places them in a garden. And here we find that Jesus is now placed in a garden. He's placed in a tomb, in a garden. It says, "Now there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid." So there they laid Jesus because of the Jews' preparation day, for the tomb was nearby. And then we come here to verse 1, and the first thing that I want you to see this morning is the arrival at the tomb. Jesus has been in this tomb, and he has died. And just to make sure, while he was on the cross, you remember that there was a soldier who took a spear and went into his side. And John says that water and blood gushed out from his side. Jesus is dead. He is for sure dead. He has been laid in a tomb. And now on the first day of the week, and I've got to show you something here. On the first day of the week, that's Sunday, and that's why we meet today, is because today is the first day of the week. But may I back up a little bit here in our idea that we find in Genesis? Day 7 is before day 1. And on day 7 it says that God rested. On day 6 it was when God created man. And that would have been the day that Jesus was on the cross. on Friday. He was on the cross. That was the 6th day of the week. And He rested on the 7th. And now we come to the first day. While on the cross, Jesus was recreating something for man that man could not do for himself. He was repairing and restoring humanity of whom He had created on the 6th day. And now here on the 6th day, He is restoring humanity. And after He restores humanity through His death on the cross on day 7, He is laid in a tomb and He is resting. Now we come to day 1. It says the first day of the week. We have 3 characters in our story today. Jesus is not one of those characters, by the way. There are 3 characters, and it's Mary Magdalene, and it is John, and it is Peter. The first character is introduced here. It says the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene, and we don't know much about her, but we can go to the other Gospels and learn a little bit about Mary Magdalene. But we know also from looking at the other Gospels that Mary Magdalene is not the only one here. This is a fascinating way that John tells the story, because there are other women there, according to the other Gospels, that come to the tomb on the first day of the week, and they're going to come to anoint the body of Jesus after the Sabbath, and then they're free to roam about and travel because of the Sabbath day restrictions have been lifted, and they come now to the first day of the week. Mary Magdalene and many other women is what Matthew and Mark and Luke say. But John just focuses in on Mary Magdalene. It's kind of like a movie, isn't it? You watch a movie and there'll be a group of people, but then the camera will just go and focus on that one person. That's what John does here. He focuses on Mary Magdalene only. And I think there's significance in focusing on Mary Magdalene, because Mary represents a type of a person. I personally can identify with Mary Magdalene, and I'm sure you can too if you would think about it. But Mary Magdalene at one time was possessed by a devil, wasn't she? She was unclean. She was an outcast. She was a nobody, and nobody wanted to be around her, and she was not fit to come to worship. But Jesus came to her, didn't he? He came to her and He rescued her. That's a type of a person, and it was that type of person who would witness to what we see here today. And John says that Mary Magdalene went to the tomb early, and there's other women there. But look at this, while it was still dark. The gospel begins, and I mean the Gospel of John begins in verse 5. Let's go back there, and I want you to see this. At the very, very beginning of his gospel, in verse 5 of the whole book, listen to this. It says, "And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it." If you fast forward over to chapter 13 in verse 30, and I've told you over the last few weeks that these last few chapters, it's been night. Notice what it says in verse 30 of chapter 13. It says, "Having received the piece of bread, and he went out immediately." And look at what John writes in verse 30. "And it was night." It is a dark time, and before Jesus came, it was a dark world. Jesus was that light who comes to the dark, and He shines in the darkness. And the darkness could not comprehend it. And John says there in verse 1 of chapter 20 that Mary Magdalene came and it was dark. It was still night. It was before the sun came up. But I think there's more significance to what John is saying here to us, is that Jesus brought light to the world. And so they come there, and they are kind of in the dark, aren't they? They are not understanding. They are not expecting what they are going to see and then believe. And it says they saw that the stone had been taken away, and I cannot help but remember the story of Lazarus as well. When Lazarus had died and Jesus comes there to where Lazarus was and he says, "Take away the stone." And here John reminds us of that same phrase, and it says there that the stone had been removed. The stone had been taken away. And so when they come there and they see that the stone had been taken away, notice there in verse 2, then she ran and came to Simon Peter, that's the second character in the story, and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved, and that's John. John has been referred to that in a couple of times in the gospel. He is sometimes called the other disciple, and sometimes he's called the one whom Jesus loved. He was the one who leaned on Jesus' chest at the Last Supper. It is John, it is the writer of the book, and he downplays his own role here, but it's John and Peter and Mary Magdalene that we see. And Mary Magdalene runs to these two. They are undoubtedly on their way to the tomb as well, and she runs to them, and this is what she says. She says, "They have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid Him." There's a couple of things I want to bring your attention to, and the first thing is she says, "They." Who is they? Who does she think has taken away the Lord? Well, she probably is referring to the Jews, because the Jews had complained that He better be dead. You better go break His legs. And then Joseph of Arimathea begs the body of Jesus because he knows that the Jews would like to get a hold of Jesus. And now these disciples, Mary, they believe that maybe the Jews have taken Jesus away. And then she says, "We," and she's talking about the other women that had come to the tomb. "We do not know where He is." The question in this text is, where is Jesus? You know, earlier in the gospel, the question is begged, who is Jesus? But now the question is, where is Jesus? Look at verse 3, and the second thing I want you to see this morning is the inspection of the tomb. Notice there in verse 3, in verses 3 through 7 is where I want us to center our thoughts. And Peter therefore went out, and the other disciples, and were going to the tomb. So they both ran together, and the other disciple outran Peter and came to the tomb first. This is a kind of an interesting verse, isn't it? Is that when they are told this, that they begin to run. When she realizes that Jesus is not there, she begins to run. There's a little bit, maybe a panic. There is a misunderstanding. Where is Jesus? And then she comes to Peter and John, and they hear this, and they think to themselves, there's a little bit of a panic. I don't know. I want to know where Jesus is. Where is Jesus? Where is He? So they begin to run as well. John outruns Peter, and that's really not the point of the story. It's interesting, but I think what it also shows here is these people are human, and there are differences between them. You and you and you and you and you and all of you are all different, aren't you? We are not just clones. We're not just robots. We're not just people. And this story is real, and these people are human people who are looking for Jesus, and they are all different. Mary comes from a different background. She was unclean. She was demon-possessed, but Jesus has made her clean. She's different. Peter and John are different. One is probably Peter's a little older, and he's just a little slower. Maybe has an old football injury that his knee doesn't work just as well as the other guy. And maybe John just stays in shape. Maybe he goes to Planet Fitness a little more often. He is in shape, and he outruns. But what it shows is they're just all different. They're just different people. But look at their reactions as they come to the tomb. This is where it really gets interesting. Because when John comes to the tomb, it says that he stoops down. He's cautious, isn't he? And he just looks into the tomb. I want you to pay attention to what John saw. look at what John saw. He is a witness. Mary is a witness. And Peter is a witness to what they are seeing here. They're looking for Jesus, and they are witnesses. And listen to what they say about what they see in the tomb. John, it says there in verse 5, and he, John, stooping down and looking in, he saw the linen clothes lying there. Yet he did not go in. Where is Jesus? What John sees is a pile of linen clothes that had been wrapped around Jesus, but there is no body. There is no body. He sees a pile of clothes. Well, notice what happens next. He did not go in. He's cautious. He's looking from the outside. This is undoubtedly just a small opening in the side of a mountain, a little cave that's been cut into the mountain. There's a stone that would be rolled in front, but it's been rolled away so they can come to the door and they can stoop down and they can look in a small little opening. It steps down and there's probably a slab there where they would lay the body, but all he sees is a pile of linen clothes. There is no body. But notice what happens next. It says, then Simon Peter came. He finally shows up. He's a little slower, isn't he? You know, he's always, I got to stop here for just a second, just a little bit of humor. He's always criticized for speaking up too early and jumping in there and putting his foot in his mouth. Yet he's the second one to the tomb. He's a little slow, isn't he? He's fast with his emotions, but he's a little slow. But he shows up. He finally gets there. And what does he do? Well, he does follow the pattern of his personality because he goes on in. I'm going on in. He goes on into the tomb. He just goes right past John. John's at the door of the tomb looking in, cautious, tentative about this, and Peter shows up and he maybe even makes physical contact, pushes him out of the way, and goes on into the tomb. And I'm going to check this out. And Peter goes on in. He's got to be here. Jesus has got to be here. You've just been mistaken. Mary, you're wrong. John, you're just not seeing it. I'm going to find him. I'm going to go on in. And Peter goes on into the tomb. And what does he see? He also sees the linen clothes lying there. The linen clothes that had been wrapped around Jesus, and it's just a pile of clothes. Jesus is not there. Well, what else does he see? Does he see anything else? It says in verse 7, and the handkerchief, that's the face cloth that had been around his head, not lying with the linen clothes, but folded together in a place by itself. I want to show you something before we really dive into that. Go back to chapter 11. I referred to this just a second ago because there's this is the second thing that reminds us of the story of Lazarus, doesn't it? You remember when Lazarus, he dies and Jesus comes and he says, take away the stone. And he comes there and he says, Lazarus, come forth. And Lazarus is raised from the dead. Jesus raises him from the dead, and Lazarus lives. But notice what happens to Lazarus after he is raised from the dead in verse 44. I'm in John chapter 11, verse 44. And he who had died came out bound hand and foot with grave clothes. You see that? When Lazarus was raised from the dead, he was still wearing his linen grave clothes. Yet in this tomb where Jesus had been laid, we find no body, but we find a pile of grave clothes. What Lazarus could not do, Jesus did. Look at this, and he's not done. He came out bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was wrapped with a cloth. He still had you imagine that was a sight, wasn't it? Lazarus coming forth from the grave. He had been dead, and he's stumbling and staggering around, and he's covered, and he cannot see, and he's bound up, and all these grave clothes on, and he's, undo this. Well, that's what they say there, doesn't it? Jesus says, loose him and let him go. Now go back over to John chapter 20, and we see that what Peter sees is that face cloth that had been put on the face of Jesus, the linen clothes that had been wrapped around him. They are laying there on that slab, but there is no body. Where is Jesus? It's interesting that he says something specific about this face cloth, isn't it? Is that it says that it was lying there next to the linen clothes, and it was neatly folded up. It is as if Jesus was lying down, and when he raises up, he sits on the edge and he takes off the face cloth and he folds it neatly and lays it there, not where his head was, but where his feet were. Notice there in verse 8. Last thing I want you to see is this, is the belief at the tomb. And this is one of the most important points of the whole text. Because as you sit there today and you've read the story of what they have found at the tomb, where is Jesus? This is where it all comes together. Notice in verse 8, then the other disciple, that's John, who came to the tomb first, he went in also, and look what it says. He saw and believed. What did he see? Well, he doesn't see Jesus. He sees the clothes. He knows how Jesus has been wrapped with these linen clothes. He knows that he has had this face cloth on, and now it's laying there, and they're interpreting, they're trying to understand, what are they seeing here in this tomb? They're not seeing the body, but they see this. And what does John believe? He believes that Jesus has been raised from the dead. That's what he believes. It's not the story about that Mary Magdalene says, he's gone. I can see that. I can see that he's gone. I can see that there is no body. I can see that he is not here. What is John coming to understand and believe is that Jesus is not only here, he has been resurrected. Jesus has risen from the dead. Well, notice here in verse 9, although his belief is, it's early, and by the way, that is in the, it's an ingressive aorist tense, and I know that's too much right now. But in the Greek, it means that he began to believe something at that point. It wasn't his faith in Jesus as the Messiah. He already believed that. It wasn't that Jesus was a great man. He already believed that. It wasn't belief that Jesus could heal the sick and raise the dead. He already believed that. He had seen those things. But what he began to believe is that Jesus has risen from the dead. That's what he began to believe at that point. He's not here. He is risen. Well, notice there in verse 9 what the narrator tells you. Tells you something about his understanding and belief, and also Peter as well, and everyone, is this. For as yet they, and that's the disciples, that's his followers, they did not know the Scripture that he must rise again from the dead. Now don't go, I was going to say click past that word. Don't go past that word must. Because that is the key to what verse 9 is telling you. It's must. It's a necessity. It's necessary for Him to rise again. They did not understand that. What John does understand, though, is that He has risen from the dead. But what he would go on to understand in the future is the necessity of the resurrection. There's something interesting here, isn't there? Is that John believed without further evidence. Now, me and you have some advantages, don't we? We have the entire Scripture in front of us, and we can search the Scriptures, and we should read it, and we should try to understand what God said through the prophets in the Old Testament about Jesus coming, and we should look to the letters of Paul and the letters of John and Peter's writings and all of the writings in the New Testament to put it all together. But here to this point, they had nothing yet to put it all together. They did not know the Scripture, but what they're saying is this: we see it and we believe it. We see it. This is what we're seeing. We're seeing that we come to a tomb, and I'm seeing a pile of clothes and a face cloth here, and Jesus is not here. And they know Jesus, and they say this: He has risen. They didn't have to go through long arguments. There wasn't a long bit of time that went by to where someone would have to prove it to them and talk them into it and convince them. They were already persuaded that Jesus has risen from the dead. Notice there in verse 10, it kind of ends on a very unremarkable note, doesn't it? You would think that they leave here and they go shouting and proclaiming, and they go out and bragging and boasting about Jesus has risen. It says they just went to their homes. You read later on in the gospel, you'll find that they do go back to their homes, and someone comes to their home. His name is Jesus. He's going to knock on the door. What are y'all doing? I'm here. I'm not dead. I'm alive. And he spends an evening with them. He comes to their door. Even though they go home, even though they shut the door, even though they're not sure what to do next, Jesus comes to them. I want you to know that in your life that Jesus will come to you. And He will knock on your door. Now, what are you going to do? I want to show you something before we come to a close back in chapter 2. Back in chapter 2 of John, in verse 19 through 22, listen to this. Jesus answered and said unto them in 2:19, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Oh, blasphemy. There's always a mocker, isn't there? There's always a scoffer. There's always one in the crowd that's going to be critical and is going to pick apart what someone says. And that's what happens there in verse 20. Then the Jews said, it has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days? But the narrator of the book, the writer of the book, tells us in 21, he wasn't talking about the temple. Well, the mocker and the scoffer is quick to try to punch holes in this and to criticize Jesus and to doubt Him and just to be skeptical. But that's not what he was talking about, was he? In verse 21, but he was speaking of the temple of his body. Listen to this. Therefore, when he had risen from the dead, verse 22, his disciples remembered that he had said this to them. I think back there in verse 9, when it was talking about they did not yet know the Scripture that He must rise again. There were some that began to remember this teaching. There were some that remembered some things that were said in the Old Testament. And then they began to put it together and understand this was a necessity. And Jesus has been telling us this all along, that He was going to raise Himself up in 3 days. I want to close with this. simple question. Will you believe? Will you? Will you believe? Will you believe that Jesus has given His life for you? And when He gave His life for you, that He demonstrated His power over death and over sin by rising again the third day. Will you believe? Notice there at the end of chapter 20, go back to over there to chapter 20 and in verse 31, it says, these things are written. This is kind of the whole summary of the entire Gospel of John. These things are written from the beginning of the Gospel to the end of the Gospel. Listen to this. My little question wasn't original, was it? I got it right out of John chapter 20 and verse 31. These things are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in His name. That's why these things are written. That's what the story of the resurrection is all about, is that Jesus died, but now He lives. I want to end with this. Those things that are more unchangeable and permanent than anything else, it has to be death. I don't have any control over death. There's not a person in this world that can reverse death. But there is a way. There is a triumph and an overcoming over death. It's the most unchangeable, the most permanent, the biggest and the painful enemy that humanity will ever encounter. But listen to this. He lives. Jesus lives. He is the only way. There are not multiple ways. There are not multiple roads to the same thing. There is one way. Jesus said, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. He lives today. On that sixth day, Jesus was laid in the garden. Back many, many thousands of years before this, Adam and Eve stood in the garden and they doubted God. And a curse that seemed to be insurmountable and irreversible was placed on all of humanity in a garden. In a garden. But on this sixth day, the day of man, Jesus was laid in the garden. And through His death, He defeated and reversed the curse of sin. Listen to me very carefully. It all started in a garden, and it all ended in a garden. On the seventh day, just as God rested, Jesus rested in a tomb. And on the first day, it's a new day, isn't it? Because He lives. I'm going to ask our musicians to come and lead us in a song of invitation. I'm going to ask you to stand this morning. I want us to all bow our heads, and I want us to pray while our musicians are preparing. And I want to lead you in prayer. And I pray that you all are at peace. I hope that you can say, it is well with my soul.